Excuse me, everyone. We have all speakers in conference. Please be aware that each of your lines is in a listen-only mode. I would now like to turn the conference over to Mr. Paul Atkins. Mr. Atkins, please begin.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, everybody, for joining us this afternoon for our discussion on the efforts by politicized shareholder activists to try to place restrictions on corporate speech. So we have a great lineup here of folks, and for this discussion. And I wanted to really thank the Manhattan Institute for their organizing this conference under their auspices. And as the seminar, the conference operator will be announcing here shortly about how we want to entertain questions during our webinar. And we encourage you all, we want to try to make it as interactive as possible given the technology constraints of this particular platform. But what I'd encourage you all to do is pose questions anonymously. You don't need to identify who you are, and there's the capability of doing it in writing. So today we have, besides myself here, we have three other people who are joining me today, and they're all very experts, very much experts on this particular issue. First of all, Brian Cartwright, who's a colleague of mine. He's a senior advisor to Potomac Global Partners, and he's also a scholar in residence at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He's a former general counsel of the SEC from 2006 to 2009, and he was a partner of Latham & Watkins for several years, we'll put it that way. And holding many senior positions at that firm. Jim Copeland, who is director of the Manhattan Institute Center for Legal Policy. He joins us here from New York, and he oversees two of the Institute's websites, pointoflaw.com and the Institute's corporate governance website, which is proxymonitor.org, and I encourage you all to visit those websites because they have a plethora of information about corporate governance and shareholder proposals and other sorts of things. It's sort of one-stop shopping if you go to that site. Last but not least, Andy Pincus, who's a partner at Mayer Brown in Washington, D.C., and he's also co-director of the Yale Law School's Supreme Court Advocacy Clinic. He's very much of a Supreme Court scholar and practitioner. He's also a former general counsel of the U.S. Department of Commerce back from 1997 until 2000. And yours truly, Paul Atkins. I'm CEO of Potomac Global Partners. I'm also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, and I was an SEC commissioner from 2002 until 2008. So to our topic today, what we wanted to talk about is the landscape with respect to special interest activists who have focused on disclosure of corporate spending and public advocacy to advance the political agenda of those activists. And we've seen, a lot of activity in the past few years. And basically, they have these activists have focused on various avenues to try to advance their agenda, and that's been through activity here in Washington, through federal legislation, and then also pressure on agencies, and that's not just the Securities and Exchange Commission, but as I'll mention in a few minutes, the alphabet soup of agencies in Washington. And then they've also tried to advance the cause on the state level, which we'll talk about later, and as well as, of course, the topic of today, shareholder proposals. What I wanted to do is just basically, as you see on page 3 of our presentation, there's a timeline at the bottom of the page. And a lot of this activism started from from the decision of the Supreme Court in 2010 of Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission, and that helped to galvanize some of the activity on with respect to this. And shortly after that was the proposal of the Disclose Act in Congress. That failed basically by one vote, I believe, in the Senate in 2010. But then there were other sorts of pressures that were put on to the Federal Communications Commission with respect to a proposal basically for increased disclosure of who's paying for different advertisements. There was a draft executive order of the president that would have required government contractors to disclose expenditures as well as their contributions. There was a lawsuit against the Federal Elections Commission by Congressman Van Hollen with respect to corporate spending. There was an SEC petition that was lodged by about 10 or so law school professors in August of 2011. On the state level, there was legislation that was proposed in New York that was ultimately not adopted that would have focused on this particular area. There was a group that was put together by the current mayor of New York City. At the time, he was a New York City public advocate. It was called the Coalition for Accountability in Political Spending that has been advocating adoption of various disclosure provisions on the state level. And we've seen some states, Maryland, California, and Utah, for example, that have adopted increased disclosure. Texas almost did, but Governor Perry vetoed it after it had passed the legislature. As far as the SEC goes, that was not really on the SEC's agenda until the waning days of 2012 when then Chairman Mary Shapiro put it on the SEC's rulemaking agenda, and since then, as we'll talk about later, it's being taken off. In 2013, the New York State Controller, Tom DiNapoli, sued Qualcomm under the Delaware General Corporate Law, Section 220, which is a books and records provision, and he ultimately settled with Qualcomm, but that was a novel use of that particular provision with respect to these sorts of issues. There have been constitutional amendments proposed to take First Amendment rights away from corporations, and what we might see happen, of course, that CAP, the Coalition for Accountability in Political Spending, and other people have been talking about, is state regulatory actions in the future. On the next slide here, what I wanted to emphasize is that the activists' own statements really speak for themselves with respect to what the ultimate goal is. And as you see here, Media Matters is a group that whose strategy document, it was a 3-year strategy document, was found on the web back in 2011. And basically, as you see here, the goal is to try to use the shareholder resolution campaign, using the wheels of corporate governance, to try to get more pressure on corporations to disclose, and then use the data that's gained through that disclosure to, as it says here, provoke backlashes among company shareholders, employees, and customers, and the public at large. We've seen that in several instances in the past couple of years. And then basically the ultimate goal is to take companies out of the whole public debate, with respect to various issues that are, relevant to shareholders and to others. So as we see on then as you see here from the Center for Political Accountability, is that corporate governance offers a route that allows these issues to be addressed almost in an unimpeded way. And by going down the corporate governance road, it's not really vulnerable to political obstruction, as the CEPA has put it, or legal challenge, because it's contained within the corporate governance aspect of each individual corporation. And so with that, I wanted to ask Brian Cartwright if he might give us a quick briefing on how did we get to this juncture, what's the lay of the land with respect to the shareholder proposals, and how have the activists been able to use it?
Yeah, well, thanks, Paul. And as Paul just pointed out, the groups that have been pushing to mute the participation of the business community in the public arena have tried to use just about every vehicle one could think of, federal legislation, actions at the state level, executive orders, litigation, you have it, to try to attack this area. And generally speaking, I think it's fair to say that none of these approaches has panned out very well for them, which really leaves the two avenues that I'll be talking about and teeing up, the most important of which is stockholder proposals, and then I'll also talk briefly about SEC rulemaking, which also doesn't seem to be heading in the direction the activists would like. Stockholder proposals are now the leading weapon remaining in their arsenal, and I suspect those proposals are probably the reason you're listening to this webinar. So I'm going to start by introducing that topic, and then Andy and Jim will address them in much greater depth in just a moment, but let me tee them up. I think many of you are familiar with stockholder proposals. I suspect maybe more than you'd like to be. But just by way of introduction, and because the history is of some interest, let's go through the basics. The annual stockholders meeting, of course, is a throwback to a different era, going all the way back to the 19th century when stockholders were drawn from a local community and they could get together and act like a traditional New England town meeting. That historical DNA continues to be an important part of the way the state corporation laws are drafted, which very much contemplate annual meetings with shareholder attendance, and that importantly includes Delaware's. Today, of course, stockholders are drawn from a global base in most cases, and very few stockholders physically attend annual meetings. Instead, they vote in advance by means of proxies, and federal law generally, the SEC's proxy rules, governs this process. Under those proxy rules, just as in the 19th century, a stockholder could rise to his feet in an annual meeting and offer a proposal to be put to a vote. Today, a stockholder can submit a proposal in advance in writing to be voted on by proxy at the annual meeting. But despite all the rhetoric in some circles about so-called stockholder democracy, American corporations are supposed to be republics, not democracies. The stockholders are supposed to elect the directors, and the directors and the management that the directors select, not the stockholders, are supposed to manage the company. And so ordinary business matters are not supposed to be for stockholders to decide. And accordingly, that's actually what the original SEC proxy rules provided. In fact, there's still an exemption, many of you I'm sure are familiar with it, on the books that sensibly permits companies to reject the stockholder proposal that concerns ordinary business matters. For those of you keeping score at home, it's Rule 14A8I7. But that whole exemptive approach went off track back during the Vietnam War. And I think that history is interesting in its own right, and I'll be brief about it. But sometimes it's also good to know if you're asked by your CEO or your client, how could we possibly have ended up with such a strange system? And very briefly, here's what happened. There was a guy called Quentin Young. He was a fervent anti-Vietnam War activist. He's also a very well-known physician practicing in the University of Chicago area. And he founded a group called Medical Committee for Human Rights, which was very active in the anti-war movement. And just at the same time, Also in Chicago, the legendary community organizer Saul Alinsky came up with the idea that the proxy process could be commandeered for political ends. So, taking advantage of this concept, Young had his organization submit a stockholder proposal to Dow Chemical, calling on Dow to stop making napalm for the U.S. military to use in Vietnam. And under the then existing SEC rules, the proposal was promptly rejected because it involved only ordinary business matters. After all, what products a company makes should be something for the directors and management to decide and not the stockholders. But Young didn't give up. He persevered, took the case to the D.C. Circuit, and the D.C. Circuit held that stockholders should be able to vote on, quote, significant social policy issues, unquote. And the SEC, D.C. Circuit had controlling authority. The SEC thereafter felt compelled to modify its rules accordingly, and that's the regime we live under today. I mean, ever since, the SEC staff has been deciding which stockholder proposals involve, quote, significant social policy issues that companies must put to a vote and which involve just ordinary business that can still be excluded. And how does this work in practice? Well, I mean, it turns out if the activists are interested in an issue, the SEC staff is highly likely to find that that issue involves a significant social policy issue. And that's not just because the staff's perspectives might tend to resonate with those of the activists. It's because the very fact that there is an activist campaign afoot generates media coverage, and that coverage itself can then be used by the staff to conclude that the matter is a significant social policy issue. And so it's gone with our topic today, corporate spending for trade associations and other spending with political implications. As soon as the activist campaign in this topic took off, the SEC staff issued what's called a no-action letter, announcing that stockholder proposals in this area could no longer be excluded from company proxy statements. If you want to look it up, it's the Home Depot no-action letter from March 2011. That means companies generally cannot keep these matters off the ballot based on their substance. Generally, the only way to exclude such a proposal is to find some other exemption. For example, that the company has already substantially implemented the proposal, or the proposal duplicates another proposal the company has received in the same proxy season, or there's some technical flaw in how the proposal was submitted, or whatever. As a result, this proxy season, which of course is underway as we speak, there are, in very, very rough and round numbers, about 125 stockholder proposals addressing direct and indirect corporate political spending and activity up for a vote, mostly at larger companies, but not exclusively. And it usually happens the leading proxy advisory service, Institutional Shareholder Services, or ISS, has also jumped on the bandwagon, and my colleagues will be talking about that in a moment. As Paul pointed out, the activists' ultimate goal is to impede the ability of the business community to interact with the government, despite how important the government is to business these days. But the stockholder proposals typically focus on disclosure, and of course, as Paul also pointed out, the idea is that disclosure will provide the foundation on which to build calls for boycotts and occupy the store demonstrations and so forth. Okay, that's my introduction, teeing up the subject of stockholder proposals. Andy and Jim are going to be discussing these proposals in much greater depth in just a moment. I'll preview that slightly by pointing out that support for these proposals has leveled off at an average vote in favor that's under 20%. And I would say that when more than 80% of the stockholders decline to vote in favor of something, that really should count as a crushing defeat. And that should mean that these proposals should have little practical effect. But, of course, companies can choose to go down the path of voluntarily giving the activists what they want, despite these overwhelming votes. And just one final area before turning the mic over to Andy and Jim, I'd like to conclude by briefly mentioning the possibility of SEC rulemaking in this area. From the activist perspective, when you think about it, quite inefficient. They take a lot of work to develop. You have to go one company at a time. Frankly, when brought to a vote, you almost lose very badly. And you basically have to hope you can pressure companies to cave and give you what you want voluntarily. So what you'd really like if you're an activist is to bypass all that bother and get an SEC disclosure rule that applies to all companies at one stroke. And voila, a couple of years back or so, a group of sympathetic law professors petitioned the SEC for just such a rule. In response, another group of law professors coming from the other side of the issue countered with a submission arguing against it.
Actually, there were more, just to butt in here.
There was a slightly larger number.
A dozen versus
slightly larger number of professors on the opposing side. Of course, they already knew how many there were on the proposing for the petition letter. The activists then generated an AstroTurf campaign. I think that's a fair characterization. Supporting the petition and flooded the SEC with hundreds of thousands of form letters. And the previous SEC chairman, Mary Shapiro, caved into this pressure and put the matter on the SEC's rulemaking agenda, which is made public in a document known affectionately in agency circles as the Reg Flex agenda. But her successor, Mary Jo White, has taken a different approach. Mary Jo White has emphasized generally in her speeches that the SEC should concentrate on rulemakings that address matters that are, in fact, what a surprise, financially material. And so she has taken rulemaking regarding disclosure of corporate spending in this area off the Reg Flex agenda, and that means that, at least for the time being, SEC rulemaking on this topic is not in the cards. So with that, I'm done. I'd say that the two key takeaways from my remarks are just these. Stockholder proposals regarding direct or indirect political activity generally can't be excluded. There are and will continue to be a lot of them, about 125 this season. That'll continue in the future, I'm sure, but these proposals almost always lose badly, and support for them is not growing. It's leveled off at what is now a little below 20%. Working in the background, the SEC has an outstanding petition for rulemaking, but it looks like the SEC isn't going to move on that anytime soon.
Well, just a couple of quick questions for you, Brian. Maybe you could clarify what the process internally at the SEC is with respect to these proposals. You know, is it commission action that considers this, or is it some other way?
Yeah, it's very interesting. In an area that I think is really infected with First Amendment concerns, this is a matter that's attended entirely by staff action. That is, it doesn't involve the 5 members of the SEC itself, the folks who have been appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, and the members of the staff through a process that's governed by sort of a procedural roadmap in the rules, receives requests for no action letters from companies for bases for excluding proposals that have been received at the company from the company's own proxy statement. And the staff decides whether to permit exclusion or not. And in this particular area, where the judgment is whether something is a significant social policy concern, it's always struck me as kind of odd that we have unelected, bureaucrat might be the way somebody would characterize them. These are my former colleagues, so maybe that's not the most flattering way to say it, but unelected officials who reach these very sensitive judgments and decide what's in and what's out.
Well, it's definitely not the most popular thing to do within the SEC, and they view it as quite the burden. Now, so the process then, once the staff makes this determination whether or not to grant a no action request, is that commission action? Is that actionable by a company versus the SEC?
Well, a company is free to go into federal district court. Very, very few companies will take this opportunity. They don't want to be sort of the leader in some area, draw the fire. They don't want the hassle. But companies could go into federal court and seek a determination that they can exclude a proposal under the law. And if they do that, the SEC staff will decline to offer their own advice. They'll wait for the determination by the court. So it is possible to get into court. But because this is action by the staff and not by the commission itself, the agency's position is that this is not agency action and you cannot appeal from a declination to give a no-action letter, which technically is merely an expression of prosecutorial discretion. That is, the no-action letter says, you know, if you do what you say you're about to do, we won't come after you with an enforcement action. And
SEC has never gone after anyone for excluding a proxy.
I think that's right. It's proving a negative, and I'm not, I'm not sure in all the universe of all the years, but I can't think of one.
And so companies really do not have to go to get a no-action letter.
Well, I think actually the way the rules are set up, you're required to ask for a no-action letter. You could proceed having not gotten one, which the more appropriate, maybe not appropriate, but maybe the more prudent or less stick your neck out kind of approach would be to go into federal court and say, hey, we can exclude this. And as I say, occasionally that happens. There have been some successful uses of that technique in the last few years. Yeah, absolutely.
So, in Missouri, just one. Okay. Great. Well, we can revisit this in a while, but I wanted to turn the microphone over to Andy Pincus to talk about the whole narrative and what's how this affects companies.
Thanks, Paul. And I think what I want to talk about are some of the arguments that companies will hear from the activists who are promoting these proxy proposals and what the flaws are. And I should say, just picking up on Brian's comment about the SEC rulemaking, in addition to the opposition to the rulemaking that was filed by a number of professors, about a group of about 30 very large trade associations filed a pretty comprehensive comment at the beginning of last year, which we can certainly make available to anyone who's interested, that really goes into probably more detail than any sane person would want to know about the reasons why both an SEC rulemaking, but more fundamentally, this sort of disclosure is actually trying to use a system that was constructed to benefit shareholders, to inflict harm on shareholders, which is really the fundamental problem with this whole disclosure proposal. So basically, the arguments that are being made in favor of this kind of disclosure boil down to two. Everybody's doing it, and it's good for the company and good for shareholders, and both of those are just flat wrong. Let me start with the everybody's doing it argument, which is addressed here, and which is basically the province of the Center for Political Accountability, which, as Paul mentioned earlier, is really sort of the chief proponent of this sort of disclosure and the ensuing efforts to then facilitate beating up on companies to stop political spending, but has also tried to position itself publicly as the neutral arbiter of when companies are making what it views to be appropriate disclosure. So it's a sort of a very peculiar situation where the principal advocate of this kind of disclosure says we're going to decide whether or not companies are up to snuff. And what it's used is something called the CPA-Zicklin Index, which it has managed to collaborate with the University of Pennsylvania to put out. But if you look at the index, not surprisingly, it's a wholly owned and prepared product of the Center for Political Accountability, which just has a logo on it from the Zicklin Center at the University of Pennsylvania. This index purports to rank companies based on their disclosure. But as you can see on the bottom of this slide, a neutral, very, very smart and engaged person in the world of corporate governance, Professor Macy, has taken a look at it and in my view, quite correctly concludes that this is not any kind of neutral study CPA wants, which is basically that unless you do precisely what CPA wants, you're not up to snuff. So a couple of things that are worth being aware of if you're a company that's approached by CPA with the suggestion that if you only do a few things, you're going to get a better score, and won't that be so much better for your company's reputation in the marketplace than being trashed in this survey? First of all, this is a classic move the goalpost enterprise. Making CPA happy in 1 year, as many companies have found, will earn you a failing grade the next year, because what CPA does is to change the scoring metrics so that unless a company is continually moving toward the kind of very, very, very broad and intrusive disclosure that CPA wants, you're going to fall into the negative part of their spectrum. So don't think that just making them happy in 1 year is going to work. They'll be back for a second, third, fourth, fifth bite at the apple. The second thing is the way they talk about the survey results is quite misleading because what they will say as part of the Everybody Does It campaign, why won't you come along, is that a huge majority of companies are, close to complying with our requirements. But if you drill down into what those requirements are, basically a large chunk of those companies are simply making the disclosures about political-related spending that they're required to make under state and federal law. And very, very few of them are doing what CPA really wants, which is to make all of these intrusive disclosures that are not otherwise required by law. So, again, don't believe the hype that everybody is complying with our very, very broad requirements. The vast majority of companies are not. And we took a look at the survey from last year, and it turned out that less than 15 companies of almost 200 were complying with the whole panoply of CPA requirements, despite some smoke and mirrors that try to conceal that. The second thing they do, and Jim will talk more about this, is they are quite misleading in talking about shareholder support for these proxy proposals as evidenced by actual votes. As Brian said, it seems pretty convincing that 80% of shareholders don't support these things. But by not counting abstentions appropriately, by mischaracterizing where large investors, mutual funds are on these issues, CPA consistently tries to create the impression that there's more support than meets the eye. There isn't. And Jim's statistics, which his organization spends a tremendous amount of time on and which are viewed as incredibly credible in the marketplace, will give you much more of insight into that. So turning from the everybody does it rationale, which, as I said, just doesn't hold up, the second rationale is this disclosure is good for shareholders. So what's the reason there? The principal argument, although there's been some backing away from it, but the principal argument that you'll see both in proxy proposals and in the SEC rulemaking petition is, gee, these political expenditures, whether it's on political speech in association with elections or on lobbying activities at the state or local level, these hurt shareholder value. Companies shouldn't be involved in that. Now, as Brian said earlier, in a world where the government's actions have such an incredible impact on companies and shareholder value, it seems ridiculous to argue that corporations should sit on the sidelines and not be engaged in the political process to have rules set up that make sense for their business. That seems intuitive, and not surprisingly, if you look at most corporations, they're doing that today because virtually all boards and corporate officials feel that it's their fiduciary duty to their shareholders to be engaged in these issues so there's a legal environment that will allow their company to prosper. And what's also interesting is, of course, it's not only corporations that are doing this. Everybody is doing it. Trial lawyers are engaged in the political process because they know the government rules are going to affect what they do. Public interest groups from all parts of the political spectrum are engaged in the process. Unions, on behalf of employees, are engaged in both political spending in connection with elections corporations and lobbying spending because they know that what the government does will have a huge impact on the people they are responsible for employees. So it just doesn't make any sense at all to say corporations should sit on the sidelines and just become a leaf that is blown by these other political winds and not have any control over their own destiny. So the second iteration of this has been, well, we've studied the matter, and actually companies that engage in the political process do worse. And a couple of professors at Harvard and other places put out some studies saying we've looked at corporate profits, and companies that engage in the process either through election spending or lobbying do worse than other companies. As you can see here, somebody who I know well because I actually served with him in the Clinton administration, Rob Shapiro, did an extensive analysis of all of those studies and found, again, what your intuition would make you think is indeed the fact. When corporations participate in the political process, make their views known about what kind of a legal environment will help their companies, that generally leads to positive returns for both the firms and their shareholders. So there's no indication at all in any study that is reputable that participation in the political process does anything other than have a correlation with improved corporate performance. And just to add to the strategic result that's on your screen as well, which confirmed that, a few years back, The Economist created an index based on lobbying, reported on it, and showed that in 10 years of data, 1998 to 2008, companies that engaged in lobbying outperformed the market. And in fact, the more lobbying they did, the more they outperformed the market. So that, too, completely undermines any notion that there's any correlation between engaging in political spending and bad performance, quite the opposite. What this claim does tell you, however, is where the underlying argument is going. As Paul said at the outset, people will say about these proxy proposals, oh, we just want disclosure. We're not saying you shouldn't engage in political activities, although some of them, as you'll hear from Jim, do go that far. Most of them are all about disclosure. Transparency is great. But the underlying argument, which is political spending is bad, gives you a clue about what that disclosure is designed to do. Create a stick that will be used by activists who have different policy positions to beat up the company and to stop the disclosure from happening. And I think one thing about this that's very important is this is unilateral disarmament. Whatever one's views about disclosure, one of the hallmarks of our system is disclosure rules, whether it be for lobbying or for political spending, should apply to everybody across the board. This is a special rule for corporations who obviously often, but not always, take one side of the policy debate. The people who are on the other side of those policy debates, trial lawyers for one on issues like the legal system, environmental groups often, will not have similar disclosure requirements. So what's going to be created is an impression that corporations, which would have to disclose under these proposals, are spending all this money to affect the political process or to communicate their views to government officials, but there's no disclosure on the other side other than what's legally required. And so that's obviously going to create a very imbalanced picture to the public, which is then going to be used to say these big evil companies are swamping our political system, when it may well be true that the spending on the other side, for example, by the legal community, dwarfs what companies spend on those kinds of issues. Again, a reason why this is a really unfair situation for shareholders. Let me talk about one final argument that is the rationale for disclosure, which is, again, moving away from the argument that political expenditures hurt shareholder value. Another variant of that is we can't trust corporate executives and the board to oversee the risk associated with political activities and political spending, and to ensure that those activities are conducted in the corporation's interest, because their personal political views might overwhelm their fiduciary duties to the shareholders. And so the only way that we can protect against those risks is to have public disclosure. In the context of a corporate system that has all kinds of checks and balances to ensure that a corporation's activities are conducted in the interest of the company, both at the management level and oversight at the board level. So I think any company should be quite leery about doing something in terms of agreeing to one of these proposals that would buy into this kind of argument that disclosure is necessary because the company's management board essentially can't be trusted to manage the risk associated with these activities and to make sure that what they're doing is in the best interest of the shareholder. Because as I want to talk about next, that argument has really severe ramifications for the more broadly. So if we can move to the next slide. This is another reason why I think companies that may be tempted to try and buy peace by agreeing to some of these proposals really may want to think twice. Not only because in the political disclosure context, they'll be back for another bite at the apple the next year, but also more fundamentally that there's a broad, once that rationale is rewarded, the idea that we need disclosure so shareholders can be a check on company officials not properly being able to exercise their duties, what's next? And I think, as you can see on this slide, there are a lot of disclosures that different kinds of corporate activists could seek that would have just the same rationale as these sorts of disclosures. We're worried. The company isn't focused on our community. We want disclosures about jobs that are sent out. We want disclosures about doing business in companies where there are human rights concerns, because that is something that the company may not be appropriately balanced and only shareholders can. We want disclosures about environmental compliance in foreign nations, plants in other countries, with U.S. standards, because we're concerned about pollution all over the world. You can see how very, very easily the arguments that are being made in favor of this kind of disclosure translate to those contexts, and for exactly the same reason. As I said at the beginning, using the shareholder disclosure system as a way for a small minority of shareholders to attack the company and essentially pose the choice of brand damage and perhaps decline in value, or stopping activities that the company has determined are in the interest of the whole enterprise and therefore of shareholders. So a very, very concerning precedent if this were ever to get rolling. The good news, as Jim is going to explain, is it really, really hasn't.
Wait, so let me just interject one thing, Andy, before we move on. Brian touched on this a little bit, but is the materiality claims from these activists. And, clearly there's a sentiment on the commission that it's not material, and that materiality is should be the watchword that the SEC looks at when it requires the disclosure, which is basically flows from 10B and other provisions of the securities laws. So here, what do you make of the claims by these activists that this information is material?
Well, as you know, the materiality standard, although it's not mechanical in its application, is pretty clear what would influence, the reasonable investor. And I think it's quite clear that there's no argument that anything in these disclosures would. And I think the counter, and there's never really been an attempt to say that they would. And again, it's not a polling question, but the 80% number that Brian indicated is some confirmation that most investors just don't care. And they shouldn't care, because the only reason, of course, they would care is if they bought into the argument that this is, something that can inflict great harm on the company if it's mishandled, because the numbers themselves are not material in terms of the amount of spending, or B, the company wasn't handling it appropriately, and therefore there was some risk disproportionate to the amount being spent. And again, if you buy into that argument, given all that's been done in recent years on risk management and focusing both boards and senior management on putting in place risk management systems, there's a lot more to worry about in the entire corporate system, and I think no one does worry about it.
Yeah, I think so. The point is really shareholders are not monolithic. Every shareholder's interest is not like the next, and that's what corporate law recognizes. And so,
if I can interject, actually, this issue has come up, as you know, Paul, in some recent D.C. Circuit cases. And what the D.C. Circuit has said is specifically in making these kinds of determinations, there in looking at potential shareholder interest in the election context, what the Commission has to be very conscious of is that there may be groups of shareholders who are motivated by their own interests unrelated to the company, parochial interests, not motivated by their interest in the advancement of the company as a whole, and using their shareholder status to try and advance those parochial concerns is actually a danger that the Commission has to guard against.
Right, for the sake of all shareholders, and here especially where the people who are advocating disclosure then use the disclosure against the company, as we've seen in a number of
Yes, I think there's a real fiduciary duty question about the company doing things that will allow that will facilitate attacks on the company. That's something that I think management has to think about in agreeing to these kinds of things, and I think it's a key and very easily understandable reason for management to oppose these kinds of, to explain to other shareholders why they're opposing these kinds of proxy proposals.
And as we've seen from the Strategas and the study by Shapiro, there's a fiduciary duty also to advance the economic interests of shareholders, so that has to be remembered. So with that, let me turn over to Jim Copeland, who will talk to us about how investors are actually voting and how he slices and dices that information.
Certainly. We'll go on to the next slide, and this is exactly what Brian and Andy basically have been alluding to, is that companies have been overwhelmingly seeing their shareholders reject these proposals by pretty strong margins. And we'll get into sort of how this counting works in a second. But in terms of overwhelming, I want to emphasize, of all the companies we measure in our proxy monitor database, and what we track are the Fortune 250 companies, so the largest companies, which does affect the vote totals you get. It also constitutes a sizable percentage of any investor's average portfolio if you're largely investing in the total stock market, or certainly the S&P 500 in terms of your index funds, mutual funds, and what have you. But before we get into the aggregate numbers, I just want to put some caveats in there, because the types of proposals we see do shift from year to year, and that does affect the outcomes of these of the raw overall voting total. So a couple of years ago, 2011, 85% of all the proposals we saw at the Fortune 250 related exclusively to political spending disclosure, and these were largely, but not exclusively, variants of Bruce Freed and the Center for Political Accountability's model proposal on disclosure. And there's been a shift away from that in the last couple of years toward more lobbying disclosure proposals, which actually constituted a plurality last year of all proposals. We've also seen some more sort of what I would call off-the-wall proposals, such as proposals to ban or prohibit all corporate political spending. That does affect your aggregate vote totals because those get very, very low percentages of the shareholder vote. I think most shareholders are well aware. If you have to, what do shareholders think? Do they believe the sort of consensus opinion that Rob Shapiro wrote about in the study that we edited and published, or do they believe some of the more outlier studies, which, in my opinion, using quite dubious methodology, find that there's some penalty for political engagement? Shareholders say that pretty clearly, and interestingly, all 250 companies in the Fortune 250 that we track are engaged in some form of political spending or lobbying. So it is not as if there are any large companies out there that are completely disengaged from the political process, as you might imagine. But this does affect our overall sort of share those. I do want to emphasize in terms of these lobbying disclosure proposals, it's a little strange when you look at it in the first instance, because lobbying expenditures are, of course, disclosed, and mandatorily so, under current federal law. What they're really getting is a way for them to try to get at trade associations, which is really largely what a lot of this is about. It's really, a lot of this is about 501c4 organizations that are in more or less degree politically active, and they're about 501c6 organizations, which are trade associations such as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or the Business Roundtable, that are politically active, more so in lobbying than political spending, but that they are involved also in political spending. And then these lobbying proposals also tend to try to get at certain subclasses of the 501c3 world of organizations, particularly the American Legislative Exchange Council, which does not lobby. It's not a C4, it's a C3. But what it does do is draft model legislation that they sort of pass out there, and then various individuals at the state legislative level can pass these model bills. They've sort of created a template and created some firestorm, I think much of which is disingenuous, when an organization largely devoted to law and economic types of questions and regulatory questions is being attacked largely due to the Trayvon Martin case. I think that sort of tells you what you need to know about whether this is a legitimate or a disingenuous attack. But we have seen just released last month a group of institutional investors pushing more of these lobbying proposals, 48 corporations from this group. And who's a member of the group sort of tells you what you need to know. It's the New York State Comptroller's Office. These are the New York State pension funds. The sole fiduciary of these funds is a political partisan elected official, currently Thomas DiNapoli. So he's elected in political partisan elections. He's the sole fiduciary of these funds. The AFSCME, which is the labor union for the federal, state, municipal employees. Again, these are folks directly impacted by something like the U.S. Chamber or the ALEC sorts of model bills at the state level, because basically these folks these are government employees, and so they're obviously affected by proposals that may limit the scope of government spending. And then the third institutional investor involved in this sort of effort is Walden Asset Management, which is a social investing fund expressly oriented around topics other than share price maximization that would be of interest to the median investor. So that's really who's driving these sorts of questions. We can go on to the next slide here. And this is really what I was just sort of talking about. When you look at all the shareholder proposals that have been introduced in this area, 91% of the shareholder proposals introduced in this area are backed by labor-affiliated investors like the New York State Fund or the AFSCME, or social, religious, public policy-oriented investors. So last year in 2013, the most common proponent of these proposals was the New York State Fund. They introduced 8 at the Fortune 250 companies. Number 2 was North Star Asset Management, another social investing fund, which introduced 6. And then you sort of see among the social funds, in addition to that, you see a number of these religious groups, 10 various religious groups back. These are largely orders of Catholic nuns that regularly introduce a variety of social investing sorts of proposals at companies, including political disclosure. So only 9% of all proposals introduced across all of last year were by individual investors, actually a relatively small number. We'll go to the next slide, and we'll sort of look at then these sort of what do the final numbers look like with those caveats in place. And as Brian was suggesting, over 80% of shareholders are rejecting these proposals, and it's roughly been between 75 and 82% over the last 5 years opposing these proposals. Now, what are some caveats here? If you start breaking these down into subcomponents, if you, in other words, just took out the Center for Political Accountability model proposal, you'd have slightly higher numbers of support and slightly lower numbers of opposition. So instead of 81%, it'd be more like 75, 74% of shareholders opposing those proposals on average in 2013. And again, realize that the mix of proposals has shifted here somewhat over time. But it's a relatively consistent result here, somewhat remarkably so, and counter to the trend of some of the proponents here. I want to emphasize that in counting these votes, there's also sort of the question of how do you count the votes. And so the Center for Political Accountability will regularly report higher vote totals than I think they should. This is consistent in general with the social proponents of social or policy-related shareholder proposals in a couple of respects. A, realize we're looking at the largest companies. So smaller companies, if you target them with a proposal, in general, these social policy proposals get slightly higher vote total support. That's largely because the smaller companies don't have large corporate secretaries' offices that can communicate counter to the proponent's message and get out to shareholders. Secondly, the universe of which companies are in this mix can shift over time, obviously, and proponents can be strategic in terms of trying to create an illusion of increasing support by changing the mix of companies they introduce proposals at and the companies they withdraw proposals from. But I think what particularly inflates some of these numbers is the fact that without regard to the company bylaws, the proponents, the Center for Political Accountability in particular, consistently exclude all abstentions from the vote total. The default rule under Delaware law that the SEC defers to in all these questions is, in fact, to count abstentions in the total. So when you're counting the percent support for a proposal, you're counting the percent who vote for it, and a shareholder represented at the meeting but deciding to cast an abstain vote rather than a for or against vote does count in that vote. Now, there are certain companies that exclude those abstentions from the voting calculus and only count 4 divided by 4 plus against, effectively discarding abstentions and assuming that abstentions are the equivalent of not showing up at the meeting and casting a ballot in the first place. But the legal rule here is clear that you follow the company guidelines. And these large institutional investors casting votes on these questions are well aware of the legal rules. So, for instance, the company that's had a model Center for Political Accountability vote thus far in 2014 in the Fortune 250 is Emerson Electric, which had a relatively high vote for that proposal this year, just over 40%, 40.09% in favor of the vote. But the Center for Political Accountability is counting that as a 47.38% vote, which approaches a sort of 50-50 split as opposed to a 60-40 split against. And the reason they're counting it that way, the way they're counting it that way, is by excluding all the abstentions contrary to the corporate bylaws, which are deferred to by the SEC under the SEC deferring to state law, and that's the Delaware default. So I think it's very important to figure out how we're going to count these votes. So the Center for Political Accountability will show higher numbers than this. That's partly because they're looking at a subset of all proposals and they get slightly higher vote results. It's also because I think they count the votes incorrectly. They also will sort of say, well, this fund family supports our proposal, and it may be a subset of a total much larger fund family that they've convinced one manager, one asset manager to go along with their proposal, even if the majority of that fund family go the other direction. But as this graph suggests, if you look at the 5 largest mutual fund families, Vanguard, Fidelity, and the rest, only 1% of all their funds universally have supported any public policy, political spending, lobbying-related shareholder proposal. So overwhelmingly, these large funds vote against these, or they cast an abstain vote, which in a large percentage of these cases is the equivalent of an against vote.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Jim. And I know that we are at the hour mark here for our webinar, so I want to be mindful of everybody's time. There was a question posed from the audience regarding availability of slides, and yes, they will be available on the Manhattan Institute's website regarding this. It's called proxymonitor.org, so that's www.proxymonitor.org. So I invite you all to see the slides there. And I've tried to work in, questions during our webinar. I don't know, operator, if you have any other questions that have been posed here to us.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question or comment, submit it through the discussion area on the web interface. To do this, simply type your message into the save field followed by the enter key. Once you have done this, your message should be displayed on the discussion area screen.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. But seeing that we're, if we don't have any questions in the queue, we'll be happy to answer your questions afterwards as well. So if you type them in here now, or otherwise, please pose them to Jim Copeland. I think is probably the most appropriate at the Manhattan Institute, and Jim, is there a place where they can pose their questions that would be the most appropriate?
We don't have anything set up on our website for outside questions, but send me an email if you've got anything, jcopland@manhattan-institute.org. So anyone who sends an email, we'll make sure that your question gets a response, either from me or from one of our other contributors here.
Okay, super. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you all for your time and attention today. We appreciate the questions, and as we'll see how everything develops here this proxy season with the various proposals that are being posed and how shareholders basically treat them. But anyway, it's been an informative and a very interesting discussion. So I thank everybody. Brian, Jim, and Andy for your participation and your time, and we look forward to doing this again. Thank you very much.